me introduce to you Don Whale. Don has been here as an expert just about every time you'll hear it. You'll see that he was called on to answer questions. He's lived it. He knows everything about this stuff, and we're just going to let him take over. Don, I want you to introduce yourself further and your connection to the Mille Lacs Band and so on, and then go ahead and get started. I'm going to shut these lights out. That won't bother you.
No, I grew up in Elizabeth, Minnesota. I don't know how many people would know where that is, but it's north of Fergus Falls on a small farm. And went to Morehead State and got a degree in mathematics. And the interesting thing was the CIA wanted to hire me. And I didn't want to go to the CIA, and so I ended up working on the Mille Lacs Indian Reservation as a math tutor. And out of that, I worked in the public school tutoring native students in mathematics, which was pretty interesting. And then at some point they asked me to start a tribal school, which is called Nayashing, and I ran the tribal school. And then after that, I wasn't a trained administrator, so I told the chairman he should really fire me and hire a school administrator. And he said, no, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to work on the history of the reservation. And so I spent a little time working on the history of Mille Lacs Reservation. There hadn't really been a compiled history of it, and found out that there was a lot of information that most people didn't know about. And in the process, he said, well, while you're looking up this history, I want you to find this guy Kegadouche. And he says he's Kegadouche Keg. He had a soldier script. And I want you to find that. Well, I'm still looking for it. And that's what's kept me kind of rolling in the history of the area and trying to figure this all out. And some of it will get explained a little further this evening. From there, I became the Commissioner of Natural Resources for the Mille Lacs Band. I worked on natural resource issues, treaty right issues, and simultaneously I was Chief Law Enforcement Officer for 5 years, which is not a job I recommend for anyone. And then I also worked for EPA on EPA committees. I sat on the Senior Environmental Enforcement Team for EPA, US EPA, and we took enforcement actions against various companies and things that were doing violations of the environmental law. I also sat on Committee of Science and Technology for EPA, and we did internet studies and various other things. One of the things we did make a decision about was, could you have access to the internet or should you pay for it? And a small group of us, there was 50 people on that committee, a small group of us felt that it should be accessible to everyone. And there was a certain larger number that thought you should have to pay for everything you do on the internet. And we eventually won out, and as today, you know, you can access quite a bit of stuff on the internet without having to pay for it. So that was one of the things. I left the Mille Lacs Band, and I moved to Alaska, and I spent 6 years in remote Alaska. It's called Bethel. It's out by the Bering Sea. And then I worked with 56 villages out there, native villages, doing environmental work for them. And then in Bethel was considered remote, but when you were in Bethel, some of the villages were remote. And they were really remote. And so if you got in there, you might not get out for a few days. So that was basically my career. Then I retired, and now I do some work with industrial hemp, and I still do some research in historical information. So with that, I think we'll start. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the Dakota Ojibwe conflict and in Minnesota, what was going on here in 1862. And I think to understand it more, we really need to expand out and look at what was going on throughout the United States in 1862. So the Civil War is raging. Actually, the South was just about to Washington, D.C. The Cherokee and the Choctaw, they had joined the South, the Confederate armies, through treaty with the Confederates to fight against the Union armies. And that'll come up a little more significant a little later. The Ojibwe, in particularly Michigan, they joined the Union Army. And one of the things they became really noted for was sharpshooters. And they started that whole process of sharpshooters. And the sharpshooters were actually people who shot sharp rifles. But it's become today being an expert shooter, to be a sharpshooter. But originally it was that you were shooting a sharp rifle, and these guys became very proficient at shooting long distances with these sharp rifles that had a long range that they could shoot. And they would select certain targets, particularly officers in the Confederate Army. They would shoot those, would be the first targets they would shoot at. And that's went on for years, and that's now become an incorporated part in the U.S. Army and Rangers and all those types of things where they pick out selected individuals. I know in Vietnam, if you carried a radio and you were Vietnamese, you were a target. The other thing there were something called border ruffians. And this is something I just learned about. In the Crow Wing census, there was a tanner that was named as a border ruffian. And I thought, well, what the heck is that? What's a border ruffian? And it was actually people in the North who supported slavery. And they worked in the border states like Kansas and such to keep slavery going there. And they were interested in that. The other thing that was going on was in the Civil War they had a draft, but if you could pay somebody to take your place, then you didn't have to go. And one of the things that was happening in this region was that they were taking tribal people and kidnapping them, basically taking them to Fort Snelling and enlisting them and then selling them off to people who would pay so they didn't have to go. So that was a kind of a contentious spot in what was all happening around in 1862. So if we look at what was going on in Minnesota, what we find is that the Dakota or the Sioux people had sold most of their land basically south of Interstate 94, you can think of everything south of that, and actually all the way to the Missouri River. And that was all sold in 1851 to the United States government. As a result, they retained a tract of land 10 miles long along the Minnesota River, and that was their reservation essentially. The Ojibwe sold some tracts of land actually just south of here, and in fact, let me think a second. Yeah, it would be where the Long Prairie River enters the Crow Wing, and then all the way to the Mississippi River, and then south to the Watub, or the town of Watub it was, and then over and back up again. So that was one tract that was sold in 1847. A second tract followed the Leaf River and went down, and there was a line down there, and I'll show you a map in just a second, but that was another parcel that was sold in 1848. And then a large portion, tract of land was sold in 1855. So those were all land acquisitions that were going on. One of the things, the United States didn't buy the land directly out and pay in cash for everything. They did it over a 30-year period. And so when you hear about tribal people receiving government payments, a lot of that is carried over from the time when they were paying for the land, and it was basically like a 30-year mortgage the United States government signed with the treaty saying that they would pay for this land over 30 years and provide payments and all these kinds of things. And so that was going on. The Cherokee sent up a couple people that were agitators to the tribal communities in both the Dakota and Ojibwe communities. And these agitators basically were telling the tribal leaders that the United States was going to lose this war. The Civil War was they were going to use it, and they could look and see that the Confederate Army was almost in Washington, D.C., and now was a good time to revolt against the United States government. And so these agitators worked on tribal people to get that involved. At that time, the Dakota and the Ojibwe were considered arch enemies. And there's endless history about conflicts between those two groups of people. And so it was surprising when 1862 happened that there was involvement with the Ojibwe and the Dakota both at the same time doing the same event, capturing and going to war. The other thing that was happening that made it difficult was that traders who were trading with Indian people who borrowed them money over the season and then at the annuity payment time wanted to get this money back. And they were worried that the United States government would pay in paper money and not gold. And so they were telling tribal people, if you don't have gold, we ain't going to erase your payment. So that was another problem that was stirring up trouble with tribal people. The Civil War was going on. The United States was late with payments. People were saying, oh, you aren't going to get paid. There's a war, blah, blah, blah. So all these things added to the confusion, the unrest for tribal people in this region. Kind of a other side of that is that if you think about Crow Wing in 1862, what it was like, it was a frontier town, but there was actually stagecoach, weekly stagecoach, that you could take to St. Paul. And it ran every week. And you could get on and go to St. Paul and come back again. I know this is a little hard to see, but let me kind of go over this. If you see this area right here, that area was sold in 1855 to the United States government. And that's where that line title came from. If you look at this piece down here, all the way down here, here, and up, that's what the Dakota people sold in 1851 to the United States government. And then if you see this piece right here, that's what they kept to live on. And so they were really changing their lifestyle from being able to roam all this land actually out to the Missouri it went, to being required to live on that parcel of land. And one of the things that was being promoted was that they should grow gardens and do all those kinds of things. And that year in 1862, they had a real crop failure, and so none of their gardens had produced very well. And so that was another issue that was compounding things. I blew this map up a little bit so you could kind of see various things. This is the 1848 section of land that was ceded. This was the tract of land that was ceded in 1847. There's Alexandria, there's Wadena up there, the Leaf River here, the Crow Wing here, and the Mississippi here. And so those are tracts of land that the United States government bought from the tribal people. These tracts of land were reserved lands for tribal people called reservations. And this was the Gull Lake Reservation, this was a Rabbit Lake Reservation, This is the Leech Lake or Cass Lake Reservation. This was a Pokegama Reservation, and this was Mille Lacs Reservation. So those are all reserved parcels of land that tribes kept after they sold the exterior lands. And the other one is this tract of land from basically the Crow Wing to the Watub River and then east all the way to the Michigan border. So that was a huge tract of land that was sold in 1837 to the United States government. So these are all kinds of things we don't learn a lot about when we go to school, is that how did the United States acquire lands? And in many cases it was done through treaty, and treaty between the tribal government and an Indian tribe agreeing to some transaction about that. As I said, that the Cherokee came up and raised questions about whether they should try to take back their land, whether they got a good deal from the government, whether the government paid enough for the sale of their land, whether their hunting was able to hunt anymore. All these types of things were used to agitate. And the Confederates were very interested in having a second front for the Union Army to fight. And particularly it would have wanted the tribal governments or the tribes to be fighting the Union Army on the west, and they would be fighting the Union Army on the south, and they would have to disperse resources and all those types of things. So that was a military strategy that the Confederates were very interested in doing. So the question became, and I don't know how many of you knew Pete Humphrey, but he always wondered, how did they know? Because the Ojibwe and the Dakota both attacked people, settlers in this area on the same day, and yet they were supposed to be enemies. And how did they do that communication? How did they decide on a date? And I think the way they decided it was that these agitators picked a time when the moon was such, and saying, this is the time when you should attack. And so even though they weren't really talking to each other, there were suggestions that they were talking to each other. It's more likely that there was this set upon time when everybody was supposed to attack settlements and create an additional war for the Union to fight. And so the August moon was that time when that was going to happen. And so what you see here is that all the settlers from Otter Tail Lake to Leech Lake, the government employees, were all captured and taken to Gull Lake and held in a stockade there, or encampment there. Here's a picture of a border ruffian, and James Tanner was the fella who was a border ruffian in this region that was noted for on the census. His son became a Union soldier, so that must have created some really interesting family dynamics, I would thought. We talked some about this with what was going on. Kind of the key point was that the United States and the state of Minnesota were concerned about payments to the Dakota people, so they took 50 soldiers from Fort Ripley under Lieutenant Sheehan and sent them to Fort Ridgely to protect the payments. And there was a couple things payments had to be watched. One is so that nobody robbed them, because it was about $70,000 in gold that they took out to disperse to the tribal people. And the second was that tribal people didn't take it before they got it all recorded as to how it was being distributed. When the Dakota Conflict started in August 1862, a lot of families were killed. It was a very tragic time. And initial battle with a fort at Fort Ridgely occurred with the soldiers there. And it's interesting that Lieutenant Sheehan had taken 50 soldiers from Fort Ripley and went to Fort Ridgely and helped with the payments, and was very upset because the government had the goods, like half of the payment was in food and flour and those types of things, and the other half was in actual cash or gold. The government didn't have the gold, but they had all the other half of the goods, and they wouldn't distribute that. And people were mad that they didn't distribute that, and Sheehan finally went and said, no, we're going to just open up this and we're going to start doing the distribution even without the money. And you can give them the money the next time it comes around, but we aren't making all these people wait for these payments that are supposed to happen and then you not do it. And so he was kind of, people were mad at him for doing that, but tribal people were happy with him for doing that, so it got to be an interesting little confrontation. So the payments got distributed, and then on August 18th, he headed back to Fort Ripley. And he was about 40 miles or so out when the soldiers at Fort Ridgely were attacked. And I'm sorry that these two things are, Ridgely and Ripley are so closely matched, but and so that group of soldiers, most of those were killed. The lieutenant for them had tried to swim across the Minnesota River and drowned. And so there was a lot of tragedy there, and there was a lot of issues that went on. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the Dakota battles that happened at Big Wood or Birch Coulee and those types of things, but there were battles that went on. It lasted, a little over a month, that went on. The Ojibwe attacked the employees at the government agencies at Leech Lake and the settlers at Ottertail Lake. And so anybody in between there and in that time period were captured and brought to Gull Lake. And here are the two leaders of that time that were the prominent leaders of Little Crow and Hole in the Day, who was the chief at Gull Lake. He also claimed to be chief of all the Ojibwe, and not all the Ojibwe agreed with that. And in fact, at Mille Lacs in 1855, Hole in the Day went to make that land sale, and they sent a letter off saying that if he sells any Mille Lacs land, they'll kill him before he comes home. So they weren't real happy with his transactions that occurred in the 48 and 47 treaties. But under Hole in the Day, what he had done before August 18th is he sent runners out. And he sent runners out to the various reservations to have them send their warriors to get ready for the attack. And part of that was to capture all non-tribal people that lived in the area. And so these warriors took a lot of hostages, government employees, and brought them there, including missionaries. And one missionary, John Johnson, who Emigagabo, and Daniel Moores was a friend of his. They were captured and brought there, and they understood what Hole in the Day was going to do, so they sent off Daniel Morse to notify the people at the Chippewa Agency, at Crow Wing, and then on to Fort Ripley. And just to, this ain't the best, but just to give you an idea about how far things were apart and where things were at, there's where Hole in the Day's camp was up above Gull Lake, and then here's where Fort Ripley was. Here's where Fort Ridgely is. And so Sheehan had to walk from here all the way down there, and then had to turn around after about a month and a half and walk back. And then when the battle occurred on the 18th, he had to turn around and come back again. And so he ended up walking all night to get back to try to save Fort Ridgely from, and if he hadn't gotten back, they would have overtaken that fort for sure. This was Mille Lacs Reservation, and then Gull Lake Reservation was up here. And so all of these things were going on, and when Hole in the Day sent his runners out, that was kind of the standard way that tribal people entered war. They sent out runners asking other people to come with them and do whatever war they were planning. And Hole in the Day's plan was that they should join him and join the Dakota and fight and drive out all people out of Minnesota. That was the plan. Anyway, when the runners came to Mille Lacs, they refused Hole in the Day. And that was a pretty significant event. If you were a warrior and someone asked you to come and fight with them and you refused, they actually even had a song that they would sing about that person saying, his wife needs him more than we do. And there was a real ridicule of people if they didn't, support the activity and challenge. Well, when Moore got able to escape from Hole in the Day's camp and came down and gave a message to Lucas Walker, who was the Indian agent at the Chippewa Agency. Lucas Walker was a fella, I don't know if you're familiar with the town of Walker, Minnesota, but that was his brother who worked for the lumber industry. And Lucas Walker worked for the federal government as an Indian agent. And in this process, Hole in the Day and Lucas Walker had gotten into some real fights over how much money was being paid out, and in particularly Hole in the Day felt he should get an extra bonus over and above what everybody else got. And Walker didn't do that, and so there was this conflict that was ongoing between these two people. And when Walker heard about what Hole in the Day's plan was, he sent a message to Fort Ripley to come and arrest Hole in the Day. And so 26 soldiers out of the 35 soldiers that were at Fort Ripley at the time came up to Crow Wing to arrest Hole in the Day. Hole in the Day saw them come and went across the river and cut the ferry rope, which was his own ferry that he had. He was a pretty enterprising individual, and escaped this. Walker became so scared at that time, he put his family on the stagecoach, and he got on the stagecoach and headed to St. Paul. In the meantime, what was all happening was that the United States government wanted to buy another tract of land from the Ojibwe up by Red Lake. And so the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Dole, was coming up the Mississippi River and was at St. Cloud at the time. and some people stopped him and told him that there was all these outbreaks going on in the Dakota and with the Ojibwe, and nobody believed it, or he didn't believe it. And so he was sitting in St. Cloud listening to all this stuff, and then he sent a runner to go up to Crow Wing to find out what was going on. And in that process, they ran across the stage, and then they took Lucas Walker to meet him in St. Cloud. And Walker explained what was going on, and he felt that everybody up there was dead because his failure to arrest Hole in the Day. And when he got done talking, he took off by himself to go to catch up with his family in the stagecoach. And then later he was found, and it was determined that he committed suicide, and that he had too much stress on him at the time, and he committed suicide. There was a big investigation as to whether that was true or not. His family, the Walker family, did an investigation, but it was never found anything else out about it except that he was found dead down by Monticello. So the commissioner then, and here's, I think, kind of an important piece of the history, was the commissioner was on one side of the political party, and Ramsey, the governor of Minnesota, was on the other political side of the, and so this politics came into play. And Governor Ramsey told Dole, well, if you're a chicken, don't go up there. And Dole says, no, you got to send me 2 companies of soldiers to take me up there. And there was this ongoing battle about who was right and all this type of stuff, but it was political politics at that time too, everybody trying to have one up over the next person in that process. One of the things, and a real good record of that is in the booklet on Old Crow Wing, and about George Street. He lived in Sauk Rapids, and he had been told by a Fairbanks to go over to see Dole about the problems with Hole in the Day. And then he took his own buggy and went up to Crow Wing, picked up Clement Bolio, who was an outstanding person in that town of Crow Wing, and they went up to see Hole in the Day. And Clement Bolio told Mr. Sweet, he said, I don't know if this is a very good idea. We might neither one of us come back from this. And so they went and talked with Hole in the Day, and Hole in the Day agreed with George Sweet that he would have a 4-day kind of a peace time where they could work out the problems that he thought existed. And so then George had to go all the way down to Minneapolis, to St. Paul, to negotiate with the governor and the Commissioner Dole about this peace arrangement and meeting with Hole in the Day, and had to get back in 4 days. So he went down and came back, and then Hole in the Day asked him, he said, well, where are your leaders? And he says, well, I'm like a rock, a little rock. You can throw that much faster than you can throw a big rock. So that was a pretty good answer, I thought, for that process. George Sweet was always upset that nobody ever gave him credit for what he did. What happened also was that Emagabo, or John Johnson, he escaped, and a tribal leader named Bad Boy, he escaped from Hole in the Day, and they went to Fort Ripley and helped defend the fort at that time. The other person who was involved in all of this was Father Piers, and he went up to see Hole in the Day. And when he got to, if you know where Round Lake is, next to Gull Lake, and there's a little creek that runs across there, that was the stopping point. They wouldn't let you go beyond that. And when he got there, they stopped him, and the warriors there told him that Hole in the Day says you can't walk past this line or we'll have to kill you. And so Father Pierce sat there and thought about it, and he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick me up and carry me across. Then I didn't have to walk. And so they did that, and then he went and saw Hole in the Day and talked to him. And Hole in the Day had already agreed to this 4-day peace agreement, and so Father Pierce left with the understanding that things were being resolved. Simultaneously, Captain Hall, who was the captain for Fort Ripley, had been in St. Cloud, and he came back and he wrote a letter to Hole in the Day saying that he wanted him to surrender immediately, and then he got a letter back from Hole in the Day that said, well, there's a 4-day grace period here, so you figure out what you're going to do. So that's 4 days keeps rolling around in this whole process of what was going on at the time. And then there's this issue with the Mille Lacs Band. They had refused Hole in the Day, and there's Mille Lacs records that talk about this, but there's really no other records that I was able to find. And then I came across the Adjunct General's report to the Minnesota State Legislature in 1862, but it was actually given in 1863 because of time sequences. And in there he talks about how they were worried that Mille Lacs was going to join Hole in the Day. And so they got the governor of Wisconsin to send troops and an Indian chief from Wisconsin to go over to Mille Lacs and tell them that they should remain peaceful. And so he starts out his report that way, that they were really worried. Then he goes on to say, but he says that was probably ill-conceived idea because Mille Lacs had already remained peaceful. And then he went on to tell how they sent up 2 people to figure out what Mille Lacs was doing. One was a Pemberton. And there was a trader at Mille Lacs that had a huge amount of gunpowder and ammunition. And they were worried that the tribe would get a hold of that, particularly Hole in the Day. And when they got to Mille Lacs, they asked about it, and Mille Lacs told these individuals that yes, Hole in the Day's runners said that we were supposed to go take that gunpowder and ammunition, but we told those runners they should mind their own business at Gull Lake and leave us alone. And then they said, and furthermore, we told them that if Hole in the Day wants that ammunition, he should come over and get it himself instead of sending somebody. And so that really stopped Hole in the Day's momentum because he had lost track of all of this, he thought, support that he was going to get from Mille Lacs. Mille Lacs then put together a group of about 150 warriors and went to Little Falls and met with Nathaniel Richardson and told him what they knew was going on with the Dakota and what they knew was going on with Hole in the Day, and promised the city of Little Falls that they would protect the city from Hole in the Day. And then the city cooked them a meal and they sent them up to Fort Ripley. So then they went up to Fort Ripley, and by that time we're looking at September 6th. So from the 18th through September 6th, all of these things are going on. And when they got to Fort Ripley, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs was there and met with the people at Mille Lacs. They had a big powwow. They had a feast and all this, and they agreed that they would remain in peace, and the commissioner told them, well, they should go back to their reservation. The leader that came up from Mille Lacs was a fellow named Mazumane. He was the head leader of this group, this 150 warriors, and stood against Hole in the Day. His brother-in-law was Kegedushe, Keg, the fellow that started this whole search about what his soldier script was. But Kegedushe Keg was the brother-in-law to Mazumane. And Mazumane's father was named Rice Maker. And they both received a letter from the commissioner acknowledging their friendship to the United States and their good conduct and should be respected by anyone who met them. And there was always a question about these letters that they said they got because nobody could find any copies of them. One of the interesting things was in looking through the papers at Princeton Union newspaper, there was an article written in, I think it was like 1880, where a reporter went up to Mille Lacs to show people around and came across Mazumane, and Mazumane dug out the letter that he had from Commissioner Dole in 1862, and the newspaper reporter recorded what it said, and it was exactly the words that were on the documents that the tribe had about what the letter said. So it was pretty interesting that there was some verification in there many years later. And then the letter that went to Rice Maker, there was a second article, I think it was in 1912, about the son, or be the great-grandson of Rice Maker, had given a letter to a fella from Princeton to keep that his grandfather had gotten from Commissioner Dole, and that was Rice Maker's letter, and the paper printed that up. So there was double documentation that they were actually there and it actually happened and all those types of things. So that, and this is a monument that's at Fort Ridgely, and it says on there, erected by the state of Minnesota in recognition and commendation to the loyal and efficient services rendered to the state by Chief Mazumane and the Chippewa Indians during the Sioux outbreak and the Civil War. And this monument was dedicated in Fort Ridgely in 1914. And here's a photograph in 1880 at Little Falls of Mille Lacs Band coming there and holding a celebration. And this is the only picture I've been able to find of Mazumane as a leader and an activity. It's kind of interesting. He's got a stovepipe hat on. This fella here, and I know it's really hard to see, that was Shabashkin, who was also a leader at Mille Lacs. So we talked about these events, and one of the things that happened after this event at Crow Wing, and eventually the commissioner met with Hole in the Day on September 10th, and nothing happened, but people who were there said it was so tense that if somebody would have sneezed, they believed that everybody would have started shooting. And Hole in the Day left and went back to Gull Lake, and Dole went back to Washington, D.C. The other interesting thing was Lincoln's secretary, John Nichols, was also there, and he had been sick in Washington, and they thought this was going to be a good adventure for him to go hunting to follow Dole out to make this treaty agreement. And it ended up to be a pretty tense situation for him. And here's a picture of that monument. There are two people who were there. This is my son Jourdain, and this is Kurt Kelk. They're both descendants of Mzumane, and had no clue about the history of that monument. So that's kind of a summary of events around 1862 and relationship to things that were going on that we really don't hear much about. And thank you very much for listening.
If we could have you repeat the question when they ask so everybody can hear it.
Okay.
Let me turn the light on.
Sure.
This James Tanner and his son John Tanner, who fought for the Union, was that the same John Tanner who was captured by the Chippewa for 30 years and he was half living in the Indian?
Right. I think it was one of his descendants. It wasn't him because he was born somewhere in 1790s, or I think by 1830s he was gone. So I don't think it was him. So I think it was there were a number of Tanners. I've tried to look up the genealogy of the Tanners, but there were different Tanner families. There are still Tanners from Leech Lake that are descendants of John Tanner, the 30 years of captivity. But whether this Tanner was or not, I don't know because I haven't looked in that genealogy. But I would assume because his son was a half-breed, so that he was somehow tied into that family through some relationship there.
There was a book written in 1956 about that. It was that thick.
Yeah.
It looks like a Bible.
Right.
Long story.
Right. Yeah. John Tanner's life. It's the Falcon, he was called in his Ojibwe term.
Can you tell us about Hole in the Day, that when he was killed and what that has to do with all of this?
Okay. The question was, can I say something about Hole in the Day and when he was killed and what did this all mean and how did this all happen? Well, Hole in the Day, he liked to play both sides. He was kind of an interesting fellow that way. You know, he would go out to Washington, D.C. and make a deal with the government without telling anybody, which is very unusual. The other thing unusual about Hole in the Day was that culturally, Ojibwe people, if your father was, say, Manomanike Gijik or rice maker, you wouldn't be rice maker 1 or rice maker junior. You know, names didn't follow that way. Nowhere, even, you know, those names were separate. They didn't follow like we do in the English culture. You know, the surname follows down. That didn't happen in the Ojibwe culture. So it's interesting that Hole in the Day, the younger, took on his father's name without really, you know, that was really outside the cultural norms that went on there. So that was pretty interesting. So anyway, what happened then was Ramsey decided that he needed to make a treaty with Hole in the Day. So he got a bunch of state legislatures and went up and negotiated a treaty with Hole in the Day on September 16th and 17th, a state treaty, acknowledging that Dole didn't know what he was doing and there was a bunch of politics in it, but trying to settle things down too. And so the state legislature passed that, but the federal government refused to accept it because states don't have any power to negotiate treaties with Indian tribes. That's restricted under federal law. But because of this action of Hole in the Day, this aggression, Dole brought the Chippewa to Washington, D.C. in 1863, a year later, and negotiated a new treaty ceding the reservations of the Chippewa of the Mississippi. And Hole in the Day was one of the reservations of the Chippewa of the Mississippi, which was created in 1855 treaty. This could be a whole lesson on treaty rights if you were if we wanted to get into it. But so anyway, they had to cede their reservations because of this aggression. And Article 12 of that treaty in 1863 had a provision that said, owing to the good conduct of Mille Lacs, they shall not be compelled to be removed as long as they don't molest or destroy the persons or properties of the whites. Okay? So Mille Lacs was exempted from being removed, and the rest of the Chippewa had to move. But there were also federal laws that said before you could remove Indian people off of their land, you had to have a place to remove them to. That didn't happen until 1867 when they created the White Earth Reservation. And that was the place where they were going to remove the Chippewa of the Mississippi too. And they were going to move them all to White Earth. And so what was happening then is they created the reservation, and then the government started to apply pressure to move. And the Hole in the Day was refusing to move, which was interesting because he was the one who said they wanted to move in 1863. But then was saying he didn't want to move and he wasn't going to let anybody else move. So now this tension started to build, but I think ultimately tribal people figured out that they were going to have to give up their homes. And in 1863, because of the confusion about that treaty and what was going on about the cessions, 4 of the leaders that were there when they got back home were killed for signing that treaty. So it was, people were upset about the agreement to have to give up their homes and move, and also the idea that this was something that was in retaliation for something Hole in the Day had started, and then it failed. And so I believe that Hole in the Day was assassinated primarily because in 1868, that's when the movement was happening and the government was pushing people to White Earth. And people got mad because Hole in the Day said that, had agreed to that, and they killed him for that. There are other ideas about that as to how Hole in the Day was killed. There's some talk that other people, traders were involved in it. There was other talks that the government was involved with it because he wouldn't move. There was other talk about it that because Hole in the Day didn't want any half-breeds to get allotments. Allotment were land parcels at White Earth. And so because he was pushing to not allow any half-breeds to get allotments, that the half-breeds decided to kill him. There's a lot of discussion, but I don't know which one is correct, but I do think that a lot of it had to do with this removal, and that people were really upset about having to leave their homes and go somewhere else. And partially because 4 of those chiefs had been killed right when they came back from Washington, D.C. after they'd signed that. And the records show that they said that they would kill all of the chiefs that came back that gave up their land. So,
when you talk about history in your backyard, that assassination took place, I understand, right down here by Richmond Bridge, is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, it's right out your back door here where that happened. Yes?
Which Hole in the Day, Chief Hole in the Day is buried in Little Falls?
That's Chief Hole in the Day 1. That was his father. So the question was which Hole in the Day was buried at Little Falls on the bluff there. And that was Hole in the Day 1, or the father of Hole in the Day the Younger. So, yes?
What is Fort Ridgely like compared to Fort Ripley? It's nothing like it in size or what it's doing today?
Yeah, today it's just a historical place. You can go there and there's rock foundations where the buildings were, barracks and those types of things. There's really no fort, right, yeah. And so that's just really kind of a historical place under the state. Yeah. Yes.
You said that the initial attacks by the Dakota and Ojibwe that started the conflict may have in fact been instigated by outsiders.
Right.
Cherokee. Were there, beyond that, beyond those initial attacks, was there any cooperation between the Dakota and the Chippewa as things progressed at all?
No, it actually got much worse. Mille Lacs people joined Sibley's army and created a company called G Company. It was called the Chippewa Company. And they sent them out to Fort Abercrombie, and they spent the whole year going after the Dakota. And they really did go after them. And they were notorious for their, they would go out and scout way out into Dakotas and attack the Dakota people out there. And this G Company eventually entered the Civil War, and they got shipped down to St. Louis, and then they fought throughout the South in the Civil War. And they were pretty notorious for their tactics as to maneuvering and particularly setting up scouting efforts and attacks, kind of a guerrilla warfare type of thing against the Confederates. And they got a lot of high praise in the military. Yes?
What are some books or you can read more about this?
Oh. How's that? You can actually find the Adjunct General's report online. Otherwise, there's a Emma Gobble's story, Fish in the Lakes and Wild Rice and Game in Abundance by James McClurkin. Probably the best one about some of this is the Old Crowing History of the Village by Pete Humphrey. And that you can get at the Crow Wing County Historical Society right in Brainerd. They have copies of that. Old Rail Fence Corners, Frontier Tales. That's got a lot of interesting stories in there. Did you know that around 1900 there was something called the Old Settlers Club? There was one in Little Falls, there was one in Wadena, and the old settlers got together and talked about the history and wrote it down and made records of the history that they knew in their local areas. So it's kind of interesting. This is kind of a old settlers club that we've kind of reinstituted through Sullivan Township here. But there was these clubs throughout Minnesota, and I don't know a lot about them, but I see that they met and different people did presentations and talked about the history of the area.